Hello, everyone. Here we are up to day 10, right? Day 10 of the class. We are over the halfway point. We're over the hump. Hopefully you're doing well. I hope you're attending office hours and staying in contact with me. As you might tell, I'm kind of recorded these a little bit previous, so it's hard for me to tell exactly what's going on in class. It's a whole weird experience for me, for you, I'm sure as well. But anyway, hopefully this video finds you doing well. Today we want to talk about the Federal Reserve and central banking, okay? There's probably no government entity that is as misunderstood or less understood than the Federal Reserve. I just had a funny conversation with my mom this morning, right? My mom is no economic guru, that's to say the least. And she sent me a text that said, "Should I keep my money in the bank? I'm worried." So I said, "Well, Mom, why are you worried about the banks going bankrupt?" Because I think the banks are actually in pretty good shape. And we talked about this in class the other day. My mom said, "No, I just heard that the government was running out of money, and I know that they're printing up a lot of money, and I don't know that they have the gold to do that." So when you get a text like that from your parents, there's so many things wrong with that text. I didn't even know where to begin. And I don't want to kind of yell at my mother. She's a little bit older, right? So, I actually, maybe I should just send her this lecture. Yeah, maybe I'll send her this lecture. But listen, my parents are not unusual in this, right? I think if you went to your parents or your grandparents, which might be closer to the age of my parents, there's just a lot of misinformation and lack of information about the Federal Reserve, right? Most people don't even know what a central bank is. They don't really understand how central banks essentially serve as the referees of financial markets. They don't understand how central banks impact the supply of money and interest rates. They don't understand how they impact borrowing and lending. They don't understand how they impact inflation, bond prices, stock prices, right? And so these are really the things that we're going to talk about here over the next week, right? So basically over the next 4 or 5 class periods, we're going to be talking about the Federal Reserve and understand how the role they play in banks and in bond markets and in stock markets, right? So we'll really be building on the things that we've talked about the first 2 weeks of class, right? By understanding financial markets and understanding banks. And now we're going to talk about it within the context of understanding the Fed, so that actually understanding what a central bank is actually helps us understand financial markets and banks a lot better. So let's talk about the origins of the Federal Reserve, right? The Federal Reserve is the U.S. central bank. And, if you think about where central bank began historically, central banks were essentially, in many ways, custodians of a country's financial system. Traditionally, governments and the populace has been very reluctant to put monarchs in charge of finances, in part because they weren't very trustworthy guardians of the public finances, right? And so central banks, and also many monarchs really weren't that rich, to be honest with you. And so central banks were seen less likely to fall into the trap of printing up too much money, right? If we think about historically about the gold standard, right? We wanted some independent agency to make sure that we didn't print too many pieces of paper, that there were the appropriate ratio of pieces of paper to the amount of gold that you had. And so that was really what a central bank was, as a way of regulating the money supply and hopefully being a trustworthy guardian of that currency, right? Whether you're talking about pieces of paper or just minted coins, right? Making sure that we're doing this in a reasonable way and that there's some degree of trustworthiness in this. In many ways, countries that were able to establish powerful central banks were able to develop the most powerful financial systems, right? And so this is the huge advantage that England had, because England was really the first country in the world with what we would consider a modern central bank, which is the Bank of England. And so the Bank of England in many ways helped create this huge financial empire that then became a huge economic empire, right? With the British Empire, right? Because the British Empire was really based on a shipping empire. And that shipping empire was crucially dependent upon finance. And this ability for the government to borrow was crucially dependent upon this Bank of England, who was a very effective regulator of the monetary system and also a very effective regulator of the financial system, and served as an important source of lender of last resort and an important source of stability. And so this, the Bank of England is one of the reasons why this relatively small country was able to extend its power at one time over 1/4 of the world's population, right? Is because of this financial empire that the Bank of England was able to help foster, right? In the US, we had a much different view of the Bank of England, though, right? Our founding fathers were very suspicious of central banking and the power of central banking, right? Thomas Jefferson, among many others, viewed the Bank of England as a tool of large industrial interests, right? And he felt that it worked against the interests of the common man, against the interests of small farmers. John Adams claimed that banks and central banks damage the morality, tranquility, and even the wealth of countries. Now, on the other hand, you had Alexander Hamilton, who is a big believer in banking and a big believer in central banking. And he argued that the US should immediately establish a central bank, very much like the Bank of England, to help facilitate commerce, right? Hamilton declared that banks are the happiest engines that were ever invented for creating growth, right? Essentially, the founders punted on this question of whether we should have a central bank, right? Along with other very challenging questions such as slavery at the time, in which the Constitution largely punted on, whether we should have a central bank. There's nothing in the Constitution about that, right? There's nothing in the US Constitution about a central bank. So this is really left up to the future politicians of the US to determine how they wanted to handle central banking. And so, of course, when we talked about the history of banking in the US, we talked about the first Bank of the United States and the second Bank of the United States, which were the first two central banks created. And both of them didn't last very long, because once they got established, while in many ways they were very useful, they were also big targets of political scapegoating. And in part because of the fear, right? The fear that we here in the US have always kind of had about big banking, right? So during the periods when the US had no central bank, we had no unified currency. Basically, every bank could issue banknotes, right? And some of that was backed by currency, by gold or silver, but there was no unified currency that was trustworthy. We had no lender of last resort. If there was a lender of last resort, it was usually individuals who would try to bail out other banks during crises. So individuals like J.P. Morgan, but even J.P. Morgan was not rich enough to be an effective lender of last resort for the entire Wall Street. There was very little government finance and no government bank to help finance wars or big government expenditures. And so without a central bank, the federal government was very, very much hamstrung in terms of its fiscal policy. And so what we got in the period of the US when we didn't have central banks is we had regular banking panics, regular economic crises. Credit rationing was common, very difficult to get loans, and we had a very cyclical economy, right? Between 1870 and 1907, right? So basically the 37 years between the Civil War and 1907, there were 21 financial panics in the United States of varying severity, right? So during the crisis of 1907, 1/3 of all banks found themselves unable to pay deposits and were forced to close, right? At least temporarily. So this is before the Great Depression. Back in 1907, we had about 1/3 of banks failed. And so that was what precipitated the creation of the Federal Reserve, right? The Federal Reserve was really a response to the crisis, to the many crises that had preceded the banking crisis of 1907, but specifically the crisis of 1907. So the Federal Reserve and the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. Because we have this fear of big banking, um, essentially what Congress and the president worked out was, well, if we have a fear of a big centralized bank, let's break it down this way. Let's have 12 central banks, right? And so that's what the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 created, essentially 12 regional banks. The largest today are in New York and Chicago and San Francisco, right? And you can see, if we go to this figure here, you can see where these Federal Reserve banks were, and they still exist. They're still a crucial part of the US Federal Reserve System. So it's a little hard to see here, but you can see in Iowa, we are part of the Chicago region, which is one of the biggest regions. You'll see, though, how the location of these banks don't really make a ton of sense today. For instance, there's a bank in Dallas, but there's only one Federal Reserve Bank west of Dallas, all the way out in San Francisco, right? So San Francisco has this huge region here, while other central banks have relatively small regions, like Minneapolis has. There's not very many people in this region. It's bigger geographically. There's two Federal Reserve banks in Missouri. There's one in Kansas City and one in St. Louis. Why? Because the Missouri senators were swing votes in the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. So anyway, these are the Federal Reserve banks. And we don't have very many examples of organizations in the US that look like these Federal Reserve banks because they're quasi-government, right? Member banks buy stock in these. Now, it's preferred stock. It doesn't really give them voting rights per se about what the Federal Reserve does, and the Federal Reserve gives them a regular dividend. But it's not a typical investment. It's not like member banks can tell the Federal Reserve to go print money, right? But they are quasi-government. It does seem unusual that member banks actually buy stock in the Federal Reserve, but they do, right? The Federal Reserve banks are a way of decentralizing power in the Fed, though. Local banks in each district have a say in the policy decisions of their Federal Reserve Bank. And this was particularly important back in 1913, when these Federal Reserve banks were the only part of the Federal Reserve that made decisions, right? So basically, each one of these Federal Reserve banks acted like their own independent central banks, and it was mainly community leaders, community business leaders that served in them. They were very regional, very regional. Unfortunately, one of the things that we found out is they were very incompetent too, because many of these regions didn't have a lot of expertise in them, right, and didn't really quite fully understand the complicated implications of monetary policy. And this is one of the reasons why the Federal Reserve behaved so miserably during the Great Depression, as we're going to talk about. Today, what do these regional banks do? They do a lot of very important functions, right? They clear interbank payments. So, in the old days before the Federal Reserve, if you had a bank here in Iowa and somebody wrote you a check off a bank in California, that check would actually physically have to go all the way out to California. And then California would either have to wire or physically transfer the funds back to your bank in Iowa. It took forever. Nowadays, what happens when you go to a local bank and cash a check? They scan it, right? That electronic image goes to the Federal Reserve Bank in Chicago. The Federal Reserve Bank in Chicago takes money out of the one bank and puts it into your bank. Boom, that's it, right? It's taking place almost instantly now, where before the Federal Reserve, it took days or possibly even weeks and months. It's these Federal Reserve banks that issue new currency, right? If you look at any piece of currency, you'll see that it says the name of one of these Federal Reserve banks. That's actually the bank that it was issued by, right? In other words, that's where it went into circulation. These regional banks are important regulators of the banks that are in their district, right? They evaluate mergers and expansions. They make discount loans. Remember, discount loans are loans from the Federal Reserve to banks. They do a lot of examination of bank records. They collect local data. They do economic research. And they play a limited role in monetary policy, and we'll talk about the role they play here in a couple of minutes. Of all the regional Federal Reserve banks, undoubtedly the most important is in New York. And so the New York Fed is undoubtedly special. It is where the largest banks live and operate, right? It's the location of where the Fed conducts its open market operations, and we'll talk more about this here in a minute. It's where the Fed, if the Fed gets involved in foreign exchange operations, it's where the foreign exchange operations take place. They also sit on the Bank of International Settlements with the Fed chair. The Bank of International Settlements is essentially the world's central bankers, right, get together. And so the Federal Reserve of New York chair is essentially a member of this along with the Federal Reserve chair. And then they're a permanent member of the Federal Open Market Committee, meaning the president of the New York Fed is a permanent member of the committee that makes monetary policy. And we'll come back and talk about that in a moment. Now, the problem with having these 12 regional banks alone was that power was so decentralized and decision-making was so local and honestly so incompetent that the Fed did not behave in any way, shape, or form like an effective lender of last resort during the Great Depression, right? And so one of the elements of the New Deal was that after a third of all banks failed and the Fed essentially did nothing, the Fed was reformed, right? And so how was the Fed reformed? Well, the Fed was reformed in ways that made power more centralized, essentially by creating what's called the Board of Governors. The Board of Governors, if you go to Washington, D.C., which is where the Board of Governors is located, if you go to the Supreme Court, the Board of Governors is right across the street, right? And so the Board of Governors is an executive council that sits on top of these 12 regional banks, right? And so it is this executive council that essentially centralizes power within the Federal Reserve. Who's in this executive council? They have 7 members that are appointed by the president and confirmed by Congress, right? 7 members. Each member has a 14-year term, right? So in many ways, being on the Federal Reserve is kind of similar to being on the Supreme Court, right? The president appoints you, the Senate confirms you, and then you're there for a long time. On the Supreme Court, it's forever, right, or lifetime appointment. In the Federal Reserve, it's a 14-year appointment. One of these 7 members is appointed a chairperson, and they serve for a 4-year term. And once again, who the chairperson is appointed by the Federal Reserve and confirmed by Congress. What are the responsibilities of the Board of Governors? Well, the Board of Governors really have the big power, right? They make up the majority of the Federal Open Market Committee. And we're going to talk about the Federal Open Market Committee here in a second. It's the Federal Open Market Committee that makes monetary policy. They set the required reserve ratio. They set the discount rate, meaning the interest rate on when the Fed lends to banks. They advise Congress and the president. They are in charge of ultimately regulating the entire U.S. financial system. And they have this huge staff of economists for research and public education. So it's the Board of Governors where, the real macro work takes place. So you can kind of think about the Board of Governors as in many ways, kind of the macro picture for the Fed is set. And then it's the regional banks that kind of do the small, micro, dirty work, right, of managing, of doing the interbank payments and dealing with individual banks. The final part of the Federal Reserve I want to talk about here in this section is the Federal Open Market Committee. This is the committee that actually sets monetary policy. Who is this committee? Well, it's those 7 governors and the New York Fed president, and then 4 of the 11 other presidents on a rotating basis, okay? So what we have here is we have 12 members, right? I have that right, yeah, 12 members of the Federal Open Market Committee, but the Board of Governors is 7 of the 12. The Board of Governors is the majority on this committee. So while the regional presidents play a role, they're not the majority, right? They meet every week, every 6 weeks in the District of Columbia, and they essentially direct open market operations. They sit around this huge desk, and it tends to be a very consensus-orientated committee, right? Unlike other things in Washington that can be very politicized, the Federal Reserve has traditionally had a culture of consensus. That doesn't mean that you always get 100% votes, but there is this kind of culture of trying to work towards consensus. After the Federal Open Market Committee meets, they issue a directive, and we'll take a look at some of these directives, which is basically a public announcement about what monetary policy is going to look like for the next 6 weeks. And the Fed also produces what are called the Green Book, which is the National Economic Forecast, and the Blue Book, which is monetary projections, and the Beige Book, which is kind of regional economic surveys. So the Federal Open Market Committee creates a lot of economic information and economic data that people can use and businesses can use. This is the formal structure of the Fed, but I'll just say one thing about the informal structure of the Fed. Formally, if you actually look at a flow chart or an organizational chart of the Fed still appears to be pretty decentralized and powers diffused. But as a practical matter, right, the Board of Governors, and particularly the chair, has a lot of power. And in part, this is because of the consensus-orientated nature of the Fed, right? That when a chair says that you should do things, I think a lot of people say, well, yeah, we want to kind of do that to get along and go along. And then there's also just the power of TV, right? So Chairman Powell, Chairman Jerome Powell is the current chairman of the Fed. You know, he's going to be on TV. He's the one that reports to Congress and the president. He's the one that the president calls out all the time, right, by name. So the fact that in this kind of media age that everything gets personalized actually gives the chairman a lot more power, and then a lot more heat too when it comes down to that. The regional banks, while in the organizational flow chart appear to be important, as I say, they largely play an administrative role. They don't really play a huge role in the kind of shaping of policy, right? Okay, so that's a little bit about the structure of the Federal Reserve. In the next section, we're going to talk a little bit about central banking in general. What are central banks supposed to accomplish, right? So we'll come back in a moment.